Mark Harrison adjusted the silver cufflinks on his tailored shirt, glancing at his reflection in the large mirror that adorned the master bedroom. His appearance was flawless dark hair neatly combed back, suit perfectly pressed, and his expression as calm and composed as ever. The house around him, an immaculate expanse of polished wood and gleaming surfaces, reflected the life he had built with such precision. Everything had its place, every detail carefully considered, just as he liked it. Vanessa, his wife, floated into the room, a vision of effortless elegance. Her dress, a sleek black number that hugged her curves, shimmered under the soft light. She flashed a smile at Mark, the kind that had once made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. But now, it barely registered. "How do I look?" Vanessa asked, turning slightly to give him a full view. "Stunning, as always," Mark replied, his tone polite, almost detached. He watched her as she applied the finishing touches to her makeup, her movements graceful, deliberate. Everything about Vanessa screamed perfection, from the way she styled her hair to the designer heels she wore. Yet there was something different in her eyes lately, an impatience, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. "Are you ready for tonight?" she asked, glancing at him through the mirror. They were hosting a dinner party, an event Vanessa had been planning for weeks. The guest list was filled with influential people from Mark's work and their social circle, a night meant to impress. "Of course," Mark replied, his voice smooth, betraying nothing. He knew the routine by heart: smile, engage in polite conversation, make the right connections. It was all part of the image they maintained, the life they presented to the world. As they descended the grand staircase together, Mark felt the familiar weight of expectation settling over him. The house was already buzzing with activity. The catering staff were setting up in the dining room, the table adorned with fine china and crystal glasses. The air was filled with the scent of gourmet dishes being prepared in the kitchen. Vanessa moved through the room like a queen, greeting the staff with a practiced warmth that never reached her eyes. Mark watched her, noting how she seemed to thrive on the attention, the admiration. She was in her element here, surrounded by luxury and the envy of others. Guests began to arrive, the evening unfolding in a blur of handshakes, laughter, and clinking glasses. Mark played his part to perfection, engaging in discussions about business and politics, his smile never wavering. Yet even as he mingled, he couldn't help but notice Vanessa's behavior. She was more animated than usual, her laughter a touch too loud, her smile a bit too wide. At one point he saw her in a corner of the room, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a younger man, a new addition to their circle. He was tall, athletic, with an easy charm that drew people in. Mark observed their interaction with a keen eye, noting the way Vanessa leaned in just a little too close, the way her hand lingered a bit too long. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he made no move, said nothing. He simply watched, storing away the details, filing them in the back of his mind. As the evening wore on, Mark continued to monitor Vanessa from a distance, his expression never changing. He saw the way she smiled at the young man, how her eyes sparkled with something that had been absent from their marriage for far too long. And he knew without a doubt that the perfection of their life was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. But Mark wasn't one to act on impulse. He was a man who valued control above all else, and tonight was not the time to let that slip. So he played his role, as he always did, his outward calm masking the storm that was beginning to brew beneath the surface. When the last guest had finally left and the house fell silent, Mark stood in the living room, looking out at the darkened garden through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Vanessa came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head on his back. "That was a success," she murmured, her voice content. Everyone seemed to have a good time. Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out into the night, his mind working, calculating. Finally, he placed his hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Yes," he said softly. "A perfect evening." Vanessa smiled against his back, completely unaware of the thoughts running through his mind. To her, the night had been just another glamorous event, another opportunity to shine. But for Mark, it was the beginning of something much more significant. The first crack in the facade had appeared, and he intended to watch it widen until the entire structure collapsed, taking everything Vanessa cherished with it. And when it did, he would be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to reclaim the control that had begun to slip from his grasp. The next morning, Vanessa was up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as she dressed for her daily routine. She chose her outfit with care, selecting a fitted, vibrant-colored tracksuit that accentuated her toned figure. She knew she looked good, and she relished the way heads turned when she walked into the gym. It was one of the few places where she felt truly alive, away from the stifling perfection of her home. As she drove to the gym, Vanessa's mind wandered to the events of the previous night. The dinner party had been a success, as always, but there was something about the evening that lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't the guests or the conversation, it was the way she had felt, the way she had laughed and flirted with Dylan Carter, the new trainer who had recently joined the gym. His youthful energy and playful charm had sparked something in her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The gym was quiet at this early hour, the morning light filtering through the large windows. Vanessa scanned her membership card and made her way to the locker room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. She was alone, as she preferred it, enjoying the calm before the rush of the day began. After changing into her workout gear, she headed to the main exercise area, her eyes automatically searching for Dylan. She spotted him by the free weights, his tall frame easily recognizable. He was chatting with a client, his smile easy and infectious. Vanessa felt a thrill of anticipation as she approached, her heart beating a little faster. "Morning, Dylan," she greeted him, her voice light and cheerful. He turned, his smile widening when he saw her. "Vanessa, good to see you. How are you today?" "I am great," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Ready for another session?" "Absolutely," Dylan said, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Let's get to it." They moved to the workout area, and Dylan began guiding her through a series of exercises. As they worked, their conversation flowed easily, filled with light banter and teasing remarks. Vanessa found herself laughing more than she had in months, her spirits lifting with each passing moment. "You're doing great," Dylan encouraged as she finished a set of lunges. "You've really made progress since we started." "Thanks to you," Vanessa replied, catching her breath. She wiped the sweat from her brow, feeling a sense of satisfaction at his praise. "You know," Dylan said, leaning against a nearby machine, "we should celebrate your progress sometime. Maybe grab a drink after a session?" Vanessa hesitated, the suggestion catching her off guard. She knew what he was implying, and a part of her was tempted more than she cared to admit. But she quickly masked her surprise with a playful smile. "That sounds fun," she said, her tone deliberately casual. "I'll think about it." Dylan's grin broadened. "No pressure. Just let me know when you are up for it." They finished the session, and as Vanessa headed to the locker room, her mind was racing. She could feel the pull of something dangerous, something that excited her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The idea of meeting Dylan outside of the gym, away from the prying eyes and routine of her life, was intoxicating. But as she showered and dressed, a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her of Mark. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was harmless fun, just a bit of flirtation to brighten her day. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she reasoned. She deserved to feel good, to enjoy herself. As she left the gym, Vanessa couldn't help but glance back at Dylan, who waved at her with that same easy smile. She waved back, her thoughts already spinning with possibilities. Driving home, Vanessa felt a thrill of excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't sure where this new attraction would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: it had awakened something within her, something that craved more than the carefully constructed life she shared with Mark. For the first time in a long while, Vanessa felt alive, and she wasn't ready to let that feeling go. Mark sat at his desk, the soft glow of his computer screen casting shadows across his face. It was early afternoon, and the office was quiet, the hum of distant conversations barely audible. The day essay work was progressing smoothly, Yet Mark found it difficult to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to Vanessa's behavior, the subtle shifts in her demeanor that had become more pronounced over the past few weeks. He was a man who prided himself on his attention to detail. In his line of work, missing even the smallest detail could mean the difference between success and failure. And right now, those details were pointing to something he could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the way Vanessa had been acting at the dinner party, though that had certainly been a tipping point. There were other signs, small, almost insignificant on their own, but together they painted a picture that was hard to dismiss. She had been coming home later than usual from the gym, her excuses vague and unconvincing. There were moments when she would check her phone, quickly hiding the screen when she noticed Mark watching. And then there were the clothes' new outfits that she seemed overly excited about, ones that he had never seen her wear for him. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze unfocused as he considered his next move. Confronting Vanessa directly was an option, but he knew it would be premature. She would deny everything, perhaps even turn the situation against him. No, he needed something more concrete before he could act. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mark straightened, his expression neutral as his assistant, Helen, stepped inside. "Mr. Harrison, your 2:00 meeting is ready," she informed him, her voice professional. "Thank you, Helen. I'll be there shortly," Mark replied, nodding. As she left, he took a deep breath, pushing his personal concerns to the back of his mind. There was work to be done, and he wouldn't let anything distract him. The meeting passed without incident, but as soon as it was over, Mark returned to his office, his mind already back on the issue at hand. He needed to be sure, and there was only one way to do that. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, one he hadn't used in a long time. "Green Investigations, this is Samuel," came the voice on the other end, calm and assured. "Samuel, it's Mark Harrison," he said, his tone steady. "I have a situation that requires your expertise." There was a brief pause, then a response. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. What do you need?" Mark explained the situation, keeping his words precise and to the point. Samuel Green had worked with him before on delicate matters, and Mark trusted him to handle this with the utmost discretion. "I need you to follow her, gather any evidence you can," Mark instructed. "I want to know who she's meeting, where she's going, everything." "I'll get started right away," Samuel replied, his voice devoid of any judgment. This was business, nothing more. As he hung up, Mark felt a cold sense of determination settle over him. He had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. Whatever was happening, he would uncover the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig. That evening, when Vanessa returned home, Mark was in the living room, a book open in his lap. She entered with her usual brightness, her cheeks flushed from her workout. "Busy day?" she asked, her voice light as she dropped her gym bag by the door. "Productive," Mark replied, his eyes on the page in front of him, though he wasn't really reading. "How was yours?" "Good," Vanessa answered, moving to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. "Tiring, but good." Mark glanced up, watching her as she leaned against the counter, her posture relaxed, almost carefree. She didn't notice the way his gaze lingered on her, the subtle shift in his demeanor. "Anything interesting happen?" he asked casually, returning his attention to the book. "Not really," Vanessa replied, her tone nonchalant. She took a sip of water, then smiled at him. "Just the usual." Mark nodded, his expression giving nothing away. He could play this game, wait her out, and gather the information he needed. He was patient, methodical traits that had served him well in his career, and ones that would serve him well now. As the evening wore on, Mark's thoughts continued to churn beneath his calm exterior. He could feel the tension building, the certainty that something was amiss growing stronger with each passing day. But he would wait. He would be sure. And when the time came, he would act with the precision he was known for, ensuring that Vanessa's betrayal, if it was truly a betrayal, was dealt with in the most calculated way possible. Mark was seated in his office, the day's work progressing quietly around him. The large windows offered a view of the city skyline, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at his phone, noting the time. Samuel Green had promised to check in by mid-afternoon with the first round of updates, and Mark was eager to hear what he had uncovered. The wait was not long. Just after 3, his phone buzzed, and Mark saw Samuel S. name on the screen. He answered immediately, his voice calm, controlled. "Mark, I've started following her as you requested," Samuel began without preamble. "Vanessa S. routine is fairly consistent: gym in the morning, a few stops around town, then home. But there is something interesting." Mark S.'s grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Go on." "This morning after she left the gym, she met someone at a cafe across town," Samuel continued. "A man, younger, athletic-looking. They seemed close." Mark S.'s eyes narrowed. He had expected something like this, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave of anger through him. "Did you get any photos?" "Of course. I'll send them over shortly," Samuel replied. "From what I could gather, they are being discreet, but not careful enough." "Good," Mark said, his voice even. "Keep following them. I want to know everything: where they go, what they do, how often they meet. Leave no detail unexamined." "Understood." "I'll keep you updated," Samuel assured him before ending the call. Mark sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The picture was becoming clearer, though it was still incomplete. Vanessa S.'s behavior was no longer just suspicious, it was now verging on betrayal. And the more he thought about it, the more his resolve hardened. True to his word, Samuel sent the photos within minutes. Mark opened them on his computer, his eyes scanning the images with meticulous focus. The first showed Vanessa sitting across from the man, her expression relaxed, even happy. The next captured a moment of laughter, her hand lightly touching the man's arm. Mark felt a surge of cold fury. There was no denying it now. Vanessa was crossing a line, one that she had no right to cross. But instead of confronting her, Mark forced himself to remain calm, to think strategically. He had the evidence, but he needed more proof, more ammunition for what was to come. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mark handled his work with his usual efficiency, though his thoughts were never far from the situation at hand. He left the office earlier than usual, feeling a need to be home, to observe Vanessa up close, to see if she would slip, reveal more than she intended. When he arrived home, the house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Vanessa was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, her feet tucked under her. She looked up as he entered, a smile spreading across her face. "You're home early?" she remarked, closing the book and sitting up. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Mark replied, his voice smooth. He walked over, placing a kiss on her forehead, a gesture that had become more of a habit than an expression of affection. "Just finished up a bit sooner than I expected." Vanessa seemed pleased, her smile lingering as she patted the seat next to her. "Want to join me? I was just getting into this book, but I could use a break." Mark hesitated for only a moment before sitting down beside her. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, her warmth oddly comforting despite the thoughts swirling in his mind. "What's the book about?" he asked, keeping his tone light, conversational. "Oh, it's just a mystery novel," Vanessa replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Nothing too heavy, just something to relax with." Mark nodded, his eyes on the book she had set aside. He noted the title, filing it away in his mind along with everything else he had learned about her lately. They sat together in silence for a while, the room filled with the soft glow of the evening light. Vanessa seemed content, her breathing slow and steady as she nestled closer to him. Mark, however, was far from relaxed. He was calculating, planning his next move, his mind working through every possible angle. Eventually, Vanessa shifted, sitting up and stretching her arms above her head. "I should probably start dinner," she said, glancing at the clock. "Anything special you like?" "Whatever you feel like making is fine," Mark replied, offering her a small smile. She returned the smile, then rose from the couch and headed to the kitchen, humming softly to herself. Mark watched her go, his expression unreadable. Once she was out of sight, he reached for his phone, pulling up the photos Samuel had sent earlier. As he studied the images again, Mark felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He was getting closer to the truth, and soon he would have everything he needed. Vanessa's world was still intact, but she had no idea that the ground beneath her was beginning to crumble. Mark set the phone down, his mind made up. He would continue to play his part, act the loving husband, all the while gathering the pieces that would eventually lead to Vanessa's downfall. The investigation had only just begun, but already Mark could see the endgame in sight. And when that time came, he would make sure Vanessa understood exactly what it meant to betray him. Dylan Carter wiped sweat from his brow as he finished his morning workout. The gym was bustling, filled with the usual clientele, businessmen squeezing in a session before work, women chatting between exercises, and the occasional serious athlete. He enjoyed the energy, the sense of purpose that the gym provided. But today, his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa. Over the past few weeks, their flirtations had escalated, each encounter charged with a tension that was both exciting and dangerous. He knew it was risky, but the thrill of being with someone like her, glamorous, older, and clearly interested, was impossible to resist. Their conversations had grown more intimate, their touches lingering, and he was certain she felt the same pull he did. Dylan glanced at the clock. Vanessa was due for her session soon, and the thought of seeing her sent a rush of anticipation through him. He had been planning their next move carefully, wanting to take things further but unsure of how to broach the subject. He knew she was married, and he wasn't tinave about the consequences, but something about Vanessa made him throw caution to the wind. Just as he was about to head to the locker room, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw an unfamiliar number. Frowning, he answered it. Dylan Carter? The voice on the other end was firm, authoritative. "Yeah, who is this?" Dylan replied, his tone guarded. "This is Richard Lawson. I represent Mark Harrison." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. Mark Harrison? Vanessa's husband? "That's correct," Richard confirmed, his voice cool. "I'd like to have a word with you. It's in your best interest to listen carefully." Dylan's mind raced. He hadn't expected this, not so soon, not so directly. "What's this about?" "I'm sure you can guess," Richard said, his tone sharp. "You've been spending time with Mrs. Harrison, and Mr. Harrison is aware of it. Let me be clear, this ends now." Dylan swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had known there was a risk, but he hadn't anticipated it catching up to him so quickly. There's nothing going on," he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "Let's not play games, Mr. Carter," Richard interrupted, his voice icy. "You've been warned. If you don't stop seeing Vanessa immediately, I can assure you that your life will become very difficult." Dylan's hands began to sweat. He had heard of Mark Harrison, known of his influence, but he had never imagined it would be directed at him. "Are you threatening me?" "I am advising you," Richard replied, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Walk away now, and this will all be forgotten. Continue down this path, and you'll find out just how much damage Mark Harrison can do." Dylan hesitated, the weight of the warning sinking in. He knew he was in over his head, but the thought of cutting ties with Vanessa so abruptly was a bitter pill to swallow. Still, the fear of what Mark could do was growing stronger by the second. "Fine," Dylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll back off." "Wise choice," Richard responded, his tone softening slightly. "Remember, this is your only chance. Don't make us revisit this conversation." The line went dead, and Dylan stood there, his phone still pressed to his ear, his mind reeling. He had been so close to getting what he wanted, but now the threat loomed too large to ignore. Mark Harrison was not a man to be trifled with, and Dylan knew that if he pushed any further, the consequences would be severe. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, anger and frustration swirling inside him. It wasn't fair he had only been following his instincts, taking a chance. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. He was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and there was nothing he could do about it. Vanessa arrived at the gym a short while later, her usual bright smile in place. But Dylan's heart wasn't in it. He forced himself to be polite, to act as though nothing had happened, but every moment was a struggle. He couldn't help but feel the weight of Richard's words hanging over him, reminding him of the power that could crush him at any moment. As they went through the motions of the session, Dylan knew that this would be the last time. He would have to let Vanessa go, no matter how much it stung. It was the only way to protect himself, to ensure that his life didn't spiral out of control. When the session ended, Dylan offered Vanessa a tight smile. "Take care," he said, his voice strained. Vanessa looked at him, puzzled. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone filled with concern. "Yeah, just a long day," Dylan lied, avoiding her gaze. "I'll see you around." As she left, Dylan felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. He had made the right decision, he knew that, but it didn't make it any easier. The excitement, the thrill, it was gone, replaced by a cold reality he couldn't escape. In that moment, Dylan realized just how powerful Mark Harrison truly was, and as he watched Vanessa walk away, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen to her, now that the game had changed. One thing was certain: Mark had won this round, and Dylan was left to pick up the pieces of a battle he had never really stood a chance of winning. The evening air was thick with tension as Mark sat at the dining room table, his hands resting on the polished wood. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Vanessa moved about in the kitchen, preparing their dinner. She had been in a good mood all day, humming to herself as she cooked, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Mark had spent the day meticulously reviewing the evidence Samuel had gathered, the photos, the logs of her meetings with Dylan, and the phone records all laid out before him like pieces of a puzzle that formed a clear and damning picture. Vanessa's betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was a cold, hard fact. And now, the time had come to confront her. Vanessa entered the dining room, carrying a dish of roasted vegetables. She set it down on the table, smiling at Mark as she took her seat across from him. "I made your favorite tonight," she said, her tone warm and cheerful. Mark didn't return the smile. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he picked up his fork. Vanessa noticed the shift in his demeanor, her own smile faltering slightly. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Mark set his fork down, folding his hands in front of him as he met her gaze. "We need to talk, Vanessa." The tone of his voice calm, controlled, yet carrying an unmistakable weight sent a chill through Vanessa. She swallowed, setting down her own fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "What's wrong?" Mark took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know about Dylan." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unforgiving. Vanessa's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing to comprehend what he had just said. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but the lie sounded weak even to her ears. "Dante," Mark said sharply, his voice cutting through her denial like a knife. "I have the evidence, I know everything." Vanessa's face drained of color as she realized the gravity of the situation. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she sat there stunned as Mark continued. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I know about your meetings with him, the calls, the texts. I've seen the photos. There's no point in denying it." Tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Mark, I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for this to happen. It just dawned to insult me with excuses." Mark interrupted, his voice cold. "You made your choices, Vanessa. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Vanessa's tears spilled over, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words. "Please, Mark, I never wanted to hurt you. I was just lost. I didn't know how to handle things." Mark's expression remained stony, unmoved by her tears. "You didn't know how to handle things? So you decided to betray me instead." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You've underestimated me, Vanessa. Did you really think you could hide this from me?" Vanessa sobbed quietly, her head bowed in shame. She had never seen this side of Mark before, so cold, so unyielding. It terrified her. "I've already spoken to Richard," Mark continued, his voice calm as ever. "The divorce papers will be ready soon. You'll be left with nothing, Vanessa. No house, no money, no status. Everything you value will be taken from you." Vanessa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Mark, please, don't do this. We can work through this. I know we can. I'll do anything to make it right. It's too late, Mark said, his tone final. There's no fixing this. You made your choice when you decided to betray me, and now you will face the consequences. Vanessa broke down completely, her sobs echoing in the otherwise silent room. I was wrong, Mark. I know that now. I was stupid, reckless, but please don't destroy me like this. I'm begging you. Mark watched her, his expression unchanging. He had anticipated her tears, her pleas, but they meant nothing to him now. The woman before him was no longer his wife. She was just someone who had betrayed him, someone who needed to be taught a lesson. You brought this on yourself, he said quietly, and you will pay the price. Vanessa sobbed harder, her tears streaming down her face as she realized the full extent of what was about to happen. She had lost everything, her marriage, her security, her life as she knew it, and there was no way to undo the damage. Mark stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. I'll be staying at the office tonight, he said, his tone detached. He'd expect me back any time soon. With that, he turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving Vanessa alone with her despair. She watched him go, her heart shattered, knowing that the life she had taken for granted was gone forever. As the front door closed behind Mark, Vanessa buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing through the empty house. She had made a terrible mistake, and now there was no one to save her from the consequences of her actions. Mark, meanwhile, walked out into the cool night air, his mind clear and focused. The confrontation had gone as he expected. Vanessa's tears and pleas had been inevitable, but they had only strengthened his resolve. He would proceed with his plan, ensuring that Vanessa was left with nothing. She had crossed a line, and now she would learn what it meant to betray someone like him. There was no turning back. The game was in motion, and Mark was determined to see it through to the end. Mark sat across from Richard Lawson in the dimly lit office, the tension in the room palpable. The faint sound of the city outside filtered through the thick glass windows, but inside, all was quiet. Richard was reviewing the final draft of the divorce papers, his sharp eyes scanning each line with practiced precision. Mark watched him, his expression unreadable, as he waited for the confirmation that everything was in order. This should do it, Richard said finally, setting the papers down and looking up at Mark. We've structured the settlement exactly as you wanted. Vanessa will walk away with nothing, no assets, no financial support. You will retain full control of all your properties and accounts. Mark nodded, satisfaction settling over him like a cloak. This was the final step, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning. And she can contest this? She'll have no grounds to contest, Richard assured him. The evidence we've gathered her affair, the financial records, makes it clear she violated the terms of the prenuptial agreement. Legally, she is entitled to nothing. A small, cold smile touched Mark's lips. Good. Richard hesitated, his professional demeanor briefly giving way to something more personal. Mark, are you sure this is the path you want to take? There's no going back once these papers are filed. Mark met his friend's gaze, his eyes steely. I am sure. Vanessa made her choice when she decided to betray me. This is the consequence. Richard nodded, leaning back in his chair. Very well. I'll have the papers served to her tomorrow. She'll have to respond within 30 days, but given the circumstances, it's unlikely she'll fight this. Mark's mind flashed back to the confrontation with Vanessa, her tears and pleas still fresh in his memory. He had walked out on her without looking back, knowing that any remaining attachment he had to her was severed the moment she admitted to her betrayal. Make sure everything is airtight, Mark said, his voice low and firm. I don't want any surprises. You have my word, Richard replied, his tone equally serious. This will be handled with the utmost discretion. By the time it's done, Vanessa will be out of your life for good. Mark stood, extending his hand to Richard. Thank you for your help with this. I know it wasn't easy. Richard shook his hand, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. It's what I am here for. Just make sure you were ready for the aftermath. Divorces like this can get messy, even if they are one-sided. Mark didn't flinch. I am ready. It's time to move on. With that, he left the office, the weight of what he was about to do settling heavily on his shoulders. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The decision he had made was final, and there would be no turning back. Vanessa's life, once intertwined with his, would be unraveled in a matter of days, and the world she had known would crumble around her. Back at the house, Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She had spent the past few days in a daze, unable to fully process the confrontation with Mark. His cold, detached manner had shaken her to her core, and the realization that he was serious about leaving her with nothing had sent her into a tailspin. As she stared blankly at the table, the doorbell rang, jolting her from her thoughts. She set the mug down and walked slowly to the door, her heart heavy with dread. She had a sinking feeling that whatever was on the other side would only make her situation worse. She opened the door to find a man in a suit standing on the porch, a large envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Harrison?" he asked, his tone businesslike. "Yes," Vanessa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He handed her the envelope. "You've been served." Vanessa's hands trembled as she took the envelope, her stomach twisting into knots. She closed the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tore open the seal. Inside were the divorce papers, a cold and formal declaration of the end of her marriage. She sank into a nearby chair, her eyes scanning the documents in disbelief. Everything Mark had threatened was there in black and white: the division of assets, the dissolution of their marriage, the complete severance of financial support. There was no room for negotiation, no glimmer of hope that she could salvage even a small part of her life. Tears blurred her vision as she realized just how thorough Mark had been. He had left no stone unturned, ensuring that she would be left with nothing, stripped of the life she had once taken for granted. Vanessa dropped the papers onto the table, burying her face in her hands as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was alone, penniless, and soon to be divorced from the man she had once thought she could manipulate. Mark had outplayed her, and now she was paying the ultimate price. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. Vanessa knew she needed to respond to the divorce papers, but she felt paralyzed, unable to take any action. The thought of facing Mark in court, of fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win, was too much to bear. She finally reached out to David Pierce, a lawyer recommended by a friend. He was sympathetic to her situation, but made it clear that there was little he could do. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, and with the evidence of her affair, Vanessa's chances of securing any significant assets were slim. "We can try to negotiate," David told her during their meeting, his tone gentle but firm. "But I have to be honest, Vanessa, Mark holds all the cards here. You'll likely have to accept the terms as they are." Vanessa nodded numbly, her eyes downcast. She had already lost so much, and the thought of losing more was unbearable. But what choice did she have? She was trapped, cornered by her own mistakes, and there was no escape. As she left David's office, Vanessa felt a deep, gnawing sense of despair. The life she had built with Mark was over, and all that remained was the wreckage of her own making. She had no idea where she would go, what she would do, or how she would survive without the safety net of Mark's wealth and influence. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, just as Richard had promised. Vanessa was too defeated to fight, too broken to resist the inevitable. She signed the papers with a heavy heart, knowing that with each signature, she was sealing her fate. When it was all over, Vanessa walked out of the courthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small suitcase of belongings. The reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her gasping for breath. She was alone, truly alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. As she stood on the courthouse steps, watching the world move on around her, Vanessa felt the last remnants of her old life slip away. She had been so confident, so sure of herself, but in the end, she had underestimated the man she had once called her husband. Mark had won, just as he had always intended. and Vanessa was left with nothing but the cold, hard truth of her own downfall. Vanessa walked through the upscale shopping district, her steps unsteady on the cobblestone streets. She had once strolled these same sidewalks with confidence, her designer heels clicking with purpose, her arms weighed down by shopping bags filled with luxury items. But today, everything felt different. Her movements were hesitant, her gaze constantly darting around, as though she feared someone might recognize her. It had been a few days since the divorce was finalized, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. The house she had once called home was no longer hers. Her access to money had been cut off, leaving her with just enough to cover her most basic needs. Even the friends she had once relied on for companionship and validation had started to distance themselves, their polite but empty messages revealing their true sentiments. Vanessa had spent the past few days trying to maintain some semblance of her old life, but it was becoming increasingly clear that her world was unraveling. The people who had once admired and envied her were now whispering behind her back, their pity and judgment palpable in every sideways glance. She turned a corner and entered one of the high-end boutiques she used to frequent, the familiar scent of expensive perfumes greeting her as she stepped inside. The store was quiet, only a few customers browsing the racks. Vanessa approached a display of handbags, running her fingers over the smooth leather, but the joy she once felt at the prospect of a new purchase was absent. The sales associate, a woman Vanessa had known for years, approached her with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harrison," she greeted, her tone as polite as ever. Vanessa managed a weak smile in return. "Hello, Isabel. Can I help you with anything today?" Isabel asked, her eyes flickering with something Vanessa couldn't quite place pity, perhaps, or maybe just the subtle knowledge that everything had changed. Vanessa hesitated, glancing at the price tag on one of the handbags. She knew she couldn't afford it, not anymore. The realization made her feel hollow inside. "No, just browsing," she said quietly, forcing a smile. Isabel nodded, her smile never wavering, but Vanessa could sense the shift in their interaction. There was no longer the eager deference, the unspoken understanding that Vanessa was a valuable customer. Instead, there was a distance, a coolness that hadn't been there before. Vanessa quickly excused herself, leaving the store without making a purchase. The air outside felt heavy, pressing in on her as she walked aimlessly through the streets. The world around her seemed to move at a different pace now, the bright, carefree days of shopping and socializing replaced by a growing sense of isolation. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and she pulled it out to see a message from Emily Ross, her closest friend, or at least she had been. Vanessa hesitated before opening it, dreading what it might say. "Vanessa, I'm sorry to hear about everything that happened. I think it is best if we take a break from seeing each other for a while. Things are a bit complicated right now, and I need to focus on my own life. I hope you understand. Take care." Vanessa stared at the message, her heart sinking. She had expected something like this, but seeing it in writing made it all the more real. Emily had been one of her last connections to her old life, and now even that was slipping away. She didn't bother responding. There was nothing she could say that would change the situation. Instead, she continued walking, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of regret and fear. The world she had built, the life she had crafted so carefully, was disintegrating before her eyes. By the time Vanessa reached her small, rented apartment, the weight of the day had become too much to bear. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The apartment was a far cry from the luxurious home she had once shared with Mark, small, plain, and lacking in the comforts she had grown accustomed to. It was all she could afford now, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. Vanessa collapsed onto the worn couch, burying her face in her hands. The tears came quickly, a flood of despair that she could no longer hold back. She had been so confident, so sure that she could navigate the complexities of her life, but now she was lost, adrift in a sea of consequences she had never anticipated. Her phone buzzed again and she wiped her eyes, glancing at the screen. It was another message, this time from Anna Clark, the receptionist at the gym where Dylan worked. Vanessa had reached out to her earlier, desperate for any connection to her former life. "Hey, Vanessa. I'm really sorry, but I don't think it's a good idea for us to stay in touch right now. Things have gotten a bit complicated with Dylan, and I don't want to get involved. I wish you the best, though." Vanessa let the phone slip from her fingers, the final thread of her old life snapping. She was truly alone now, cut off from the people and places that had once defined her. The realization was devastating, a crushing blow that left her feeling hollow and broken. As she sat there, tears streaming down her face, Vanessa knew that she had no one to blame but herself. She had made the choices that led her here, and now she was paying the price. The social world she had once ruled was now closed to her, and the life she had taken for granted was gone. In the silence of her apartment, Vanessa began to understand the full extent of her downfall. The karma she had once dismissed as a mere concept was now her reality, and there was no escaping its reach. The woman who had once had everything was now left with nothing, her life reduced to the ruins of her own making. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to my channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story and what stories you want to hear.